Hello, welcome to Critical Witness. We're using StreamYard for the first time, and I'm hoping that it's live. I'm just checking that we are live before I hand over to our guests, and we are. So welcome, and those of you on the podcast, you will have no idea what this looks like. Hopefully it sounds okay as well. We've got myself and Dan is here with me, and we've also got Dr. Richard Playford, who I'm just going to bring on to the screen, everyone, all at once. And we're going to be talking about philosophy and philosophy of religion and how much we can learn from other religions tonight. And but first, before we do any of that, it'd be good to hear from Dr. Richard Playford. And Richard, just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and how you became a Christian and what you do now. Over to you.
Okay, yeah. So I'm currently a lecturer in religious studies at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. I became a Christian when I became a Christian properly when I was about 21, although I'd flirted with it, shall we say, before then. Yeah, and I sort of gradually grew into my faith as I progressed through university, and since then I've moved around in denominations, but I've sort of been definitely a Christian from that stage onward. And I studied philosophy with ancient history at the University of Exeter. Then I went on to do an MA in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, and then my PhD at the University of Reading before getting my current job in 2017 at St. Mary's. And I tend to work in ethics, Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, so the metaphysics of Aristotle and Aquinas. But I also have a sort of side interest in Eastern philosophy and other religions, and ethics and things like that. So I've got quite broad-ranging sorts of views. And then the thing that I've been invited on to talk about is what attitude should we have as Christians to other religions? And it seems to me within this, there are two questions. First of all, there's kind of the meta question, which is what attitude should we take for the religions? And it seems to me there are two extremes that I think are in a way equally unhelpful. The one extreme is sometimes called pluralism, where we say all religions are true, all of them are equally true, all of them are 100% correct. But that's obviously absurd because they make very different claims about the world. They make mutually exclusive claims about the world. And so they can't all be true. Maybe they can all be wrong, but they can't all be true. So I think that pluralism's a non-starter. But on the other hand, equally, well, maybe almost as equally absurd, would be to reject all other religions wholesale and just to say if it's not from a Christian background or even not from my denominational background, then it must be false, or perhaps even worse. I've seen some Christians get so anxious about other religions they think it must be demonic. And I think that's also very unwise for a couple of different reasons. But one, some religions make claims that basically agree with Christianity, most obviously Judaism and Islam, but we can also find points of contact with all the major world religions. So if truth doesn't contradict truth, then at least in those respects, they're going to have to be correct. And then I would also encourage us to be open to some of those other claims that Christianity doesn't explicitly weigh in on, but which other religions may shed some light on. And so we were discussing this before with the two of you guys, but maybe we could start by discussing that meta question, what should our attitude be like? And then we could look at some examples, and I'd be happy to talk about some of the stuff that I found helpful in my travels.
Yeah, this could go in various different directions, and it's quite interesting to think through the similarities and where things cross. I guess first off, I work with the international chaplaincy team. That's obviously Interfaith as well, and so I'm very ready to hear and listen from those other faiths. And but it'd be interesting, Dan, what's your experience across with other faiths at this point?
Well, in terms of what I think about them, or just sort of
your interaction. Like, how much do you get a chance to talk with, say, Hindus or Buddhists about what they believe?
Very rarely, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say with probably most experience would be with Muslims. Would be the sort of primary sort of group that I engage with. Had some good Muslim friends in the past that we sort of spent a lot of time trying to understand each other and make sure that we're representing each other's views accurately. To the point sometimes where, I'd have my Muslim friend explaining a sort of orthodox view of the Trinity to his other Muslim friends who were, giving, an incorrect version of sort of Trinitarian theology. So it's quite interesting to have a Muslim kind of explain, no, they don't, it's wrong, but actually they don't believe that, they believe this, and explain it. So, I think for those experiences have led me to kind of think that it doesn't always have to be combative, that we can disagree, but we can educate each other. And I learned a lot about Islam from those discussions. And I wish I was able to have more of those kinds of discussions. But I think sometimes people who are willing to do that are rarer than we would like, unfortunately.
And I would say that when you really try to understand each other, what you find is kind of correlating to the two extremes I was talking about earlier. There are some people who want to say all religions, all deep down, they all agree. If you really try and understand them, you'll see that there are genuine and significant disagreements. But what you'll also see is that there are significant agreements too. And you can only get to that if you actually put the effort in to actually properly understand them. I mean, I'm interested in seeing how the two, I mentioned that I'd encountered a few Christians who have this attitude. Have the two of you come across Christians who are absolutely sort of terrified of any other religion in any way, and what sort of reasons did they give for that?
I'd say only on the internet. I've never met people in real life who kind of say that all religions, in virtue of them not being Christianity, are sort of demonic. But yeah, I'm sure they exist. I mean, one thing that that's always struck with me is something that Tim Keller said about different religions and how Christians view different religions and how the kind of world understand it. So he always said that Christians think that other religions are fundamentally different but superficially the same, whilst the world kind of thinks of religions as fundamentally similar and only superficially different. And that, I think you can only come to that sort of latter view by just really a deep ignorance of what other religions teach. Because if you look at just Judaism, Christianity and Islam and Hinduism, I mean, they are fundamentally different in a number of ways. All right, three of them are theistic, but even very quickly then you've got Christianity that's talking about a Trinitarian God, and then people are saying, well, that's polytheist. So it quickly dissipates. But there's definite agreement. But I think a kind of even a superficial understanding, I think, of the different world religions, you can't. I find it hard to think people can genuinely think that's the case.
Yeah, I think. We were talking slightly before this show. There are certain people that are just so wary of syncretism and taking things on board that sort of blur the lines of which faith they're in. And generally, I think it is coming from a place where you're not necessarily grounded in your own faith. So it's a sort of fear of losing what you know, and fear of the unknown potentially coming into play. I just ground a little bit of pushback and why I think this is a really healthy discussion to have, and then maybe you can kind of push back on what I'm saying as well. But I see it very much as something that Paul did really well. He understood what the sort of culture and context of the churches he wrote to were in when he and Peter delivered sermons in Acts. You see them taking on board the culture, the idols, the poets that the people around them would know, and then applies them in a way that points to, well, for the unknown God, it was to the known God, the God who you can know. So I think there's definitely a strong tradition through Christian history to engage with poets and wisdom around us. And there's even the doctrine of common grace, as I understand it, that there is some truth within these other belief systems, but also there might be some devil in there. So I think it's finding that balance, that being cautious as we engage with these different views, but to just lambast them as just like your all of the devil is not going to be healthy, not going to be helpful, and it completely removes the concept of loving your neighbor, I think. So that's a few thoughts just to sort of get us started in why I personally think that's a good grounding of being a Christian. What are your thoughts?
Can I just clarify something quickly? I was just thinking. So, when I made that observation about referring to what Tim Keller said, I should say that I think when I think often people have sort of pluralistic views, is it's rooted in something good. It's rooted in wanting people to get along, because we all identify that within Western society, especially the UK, multicultural, numerous different religions, and it can seem divisive to put too much an emphasis on the difference, the things that are different about our beliefs, rather than, I think, the motivation behind that is to kind of emphasize that we all get on, that we're only superficially different, but fundamentally we're kind of the same, which allows us to kind of get on, and otherwise you end up with issues that we have going on in France and stuff at the moment.
So whilst you were talking, I was just looking up, sort of feeding up, thinking about what Phil had said. If you're interested, I think it was Justin Martyr, Saint Justin Martyr, who's one of the church fathers. I think it was him, and if anybody in the comments knows, then do correct me. He's one of the first people to get really sort of uncomfortable with other religions and other gods. But I think it's interesting to read and to think about what he's actually saying. But he attributes, or he suggests that the ancient Roman and ancient Greek gods were demons. I think there's different ways of interpreting what he's saying, and I won't pretend to be an expert on the church fathers, because I think he could be saying any miracles that they attribute to them, or any divine action that they attribute to them, should be attributed to demons, because it's not our guy, so it must be somebody else. Or he could be making like a really strong claim. I don't think on the face of it he is, but that's just my inexpert reading, where he's kind of dismissing it wholesale and saying any reference to any of those gods in any context must ultimately be demonic and should be avoided. So you kind of got him, but he's kind of like one extreme, because you've also, if you fast forward 100 years and you get to people like St. Thomas Aquinas in the medieval period, you've got him engaging in enormous detail with Jewish and Muslim thinkers. And indeed, one can argue that the Christian love affair with Aristotelian philosophy, that some of that is owed to the Muslim world, because to some extent, I think it's probably an overly simplistic view of history, but to some extent, when the Roman Empire fell, it was the sort of Muslim world that ended up eventually getting Aristotle, and the Christian world that got Plato. And then at various stages in the medieval period, the two came together and led to some of that wonderful scholastic philosophy that has been the bedrock of so much Christian faith, particularly in the Catholic and Anglican and Orthodox traditions. So throughout sort of the history of it, there's this, I guess, both open but also cautious relationship, and I guess we should kind of follow them in that. Anyway,
so sorry, I was trying to find the mute new tech. Totally agree with that. I've heard similar things with this idea that if it's not our guy, it's it must be demons. And I think there's an aspect with that in two senses. That, well, for one, I don't think as Christians we have to be as So, for example, Islam is very key about it being monotheism. That it's very much there's one God and it's Allah. Whereas within Christianity, there is this potential concept that there are other gods with lowercase g's around. There's other spiritual beings around. Why can't they be the sort of myths and legends? They aren't Yahweh. Sorry if I've used the name of God there for those who are watching who are Jewish, but they aren't the Old Testament creator God revealed through Jesus. And so it's, I think there's a space within Christianity to at least acknowledge that there might be some other spiritual elements that are what other faiths are tapping into. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's something I've been kind of wrestling with myself, trying to figure out where I sit on that.
Yeah, I guess that leads on to some really interesting questions about angelology, things like that. One of the things I've always found interesting about Christianity, and I've never quite understood why, but it does seem to be an article of faith for most of the major denominations. And I do know that C.S. Lewis played around with the idea a little bit, though, challenged it a little bit, some of his science fiction books. We do seem to assume that when it comes to angelic beings, which is what we're talking about here, that they're either fallen and hence demonic, or they're not fallen and they're angelic. They're kind of, it's very like all or nothing. I can think perhaps of some philosophical reasons why you might think that, which would get quite technical, but we could bat them around a little bit if you want. So I guess I do have sympathy with that, but certainly if you're open to it and you can allow that there might be this whole shading of entities that are superhuman, but neither good nor bad, or a little bit good or a little bit bad, or good in some ways and bad in some ways, and that would sort of really make the whole situation a whole lot comfortable, so a whole lot more complicated.
Yeah.
And the science fiction I'm thinking about, Out of the Silent Planet and that series. Have you come across that?
I've not read it. I think I'm aware of it, but yeah.
I don't read any fiction.
And doesn't.
Occasionally, in the final one of those, they end up. It's called the Cosmic Trilogy, and they start off going to Mars, and I think they go over to Venus, and they come back to Earth in the third book. And in the end, they have this old guy who gets resurrected, basically, who's been sort of hibernating, and he talks about how in the past there were kind of neutral angelic beings who were neither good nor bad, but he then suggests that the contemporary time they've either picked the good side or the bad side. But it does show that C.S. Lewis was prepared to toy around with the idea it hadn't been all or nothing. I'm not sure whether I would agree, because I think that if we take a sort of standard view of angels and hold that they're in a epistemically privileged position compared to us, it's not the case that they have to spend 70, 80, 90. I don't think, they don't even necessarily relate to time like that, thinking about do they believe in God and which side are they going to come down to. Normally it's held that they've got quite a full vision from the word go, full knowledge from the word go. And so right now, because you know everything you're ever going to know. It could be the reason why we're so ambiguous is because we're constantly learning and trying to make up our minds. And so but I'm open to that. I'm open to the idea of seeing angels in different ways.
Dan, have you done much exploring of that?
No.
I know that
angels take a very small part of my time.
Have you read Unseen Realm with Heiser?
Yeah. Michael Heiser. Yeah, it messes with me. It just messes with my mind. I can't get my head around it. I think I'm too far gone. I can't.
Can't backtrack.
I haven't heard of this. What is this?
I don't want to be guilty of leading you down the Michael Heiser rabbit trail. Yeah, he's got some really interesting views, and I think he's probably right in nearly everything he says. yeah, he's got a great book. It's the Unseen Realm, and then he's got a podcast as well, I think, of the same name. And he's got smaller books. You don't have to read the Unseen Realm. There's a shorter version that kind of summarizes all his views. But he's a really interesting scholar. I think he's an Old Testament scholar, right? Yeah. He's really interesting, but I can't. This is just some topics I read around and start thinking. I just think I can't do that.
It's time, and I know I've only read Unseen Realm and listened to I think a couple on his podcast. I can't remember for the life of me what it's called right now, but he explores the sort of divine counsel as well as the ancient Near Eastern view of supernatural, natural. It wouldn't have been the dichotomy that we have, but very much part and parcel of the life and the way they see things around them. Which, I kind of get what you mean, Dan, in that it starts to open a bit of a can of worms. He explores Satan and what who that is, what that is. So I guess, a rabbit trail is probably quite a good way to put it, and one where we're kind of going off topic for this conversation. So, let's bring it back around to world religions then. So, I think we're all on the same page that we can learn from other religions. The program, I see your questions. We'll bring in some of those questions in a bit, and then they'll keep us going for a little while. But for now, if we focus on world religions, what would you say? We're talking about being cautious about it. What kind of what's the entry level starting point of engaging with other religions in your perspective? Like what got you into it? Maybe let's start with your story. What got you into looking at other religions and why?
I mean, the short answer is it was when I was doing my PhD and I was a teaching assistant, and I was assisting on a course that did Eastern philosophy. So that's how
Right.
That's the short answer. But what I would say is that originally my first other religious love, that's the right way of saying it, was sort of with Buddhism, because I found a lot of their emphasis on living in the moment, on not grasping on to the things of this world, of being highly suspicious of the ego in any way, what we would call pride, and a lot of the practices they had towards inculcating those ways of being in the world. I found a lot of those really quite helpful, and you can translate a lot of it over into Christian terms. So I've already said, in the East, there's a big suspicion of the ego, but we call that pride, and that's a very dangerous sin for us to get involved in. Another issue, for example, for another sort of point of similarity is that for us, we have an infinite God. If there's an infinite God, there's a sense in which we kind of at least disappear in comparison to that. And the good news is he's on our side. Again, there's no room for a big ego because God's always going to be bigger than you, so to speak. So again, I think there are points of contact there. There's insights. I think the emphasis on living in the moment and acknowledging that there are things that you can't control. So it was when I was studying this at a time in my life, I was coming to the end of my PhD. I didn't know if I was going to find a job. There were lots of things that basically I couldn't control in the here and now. I could take sensible steps, but it was out of my hands. And so although, yes, there were Christian guidance on that, let go and let God and things like that, a lot of the times, sometimes it was more refreshing and more helpful to see it coming out of a Buddhist sort of context, about understanding that, we're very finite beings, we can't control things. And so you've just got to let go. You've got to let go, let happen what will happen, and enjoy living in the now. And then actually in doing that, you start to appreciate things that otherwise you'd be completely missing. And so a sort of example, I won't say who it is, but somebody I know, this individual always gets stressed on Sunday night because they've got to go to work on Monday morning. Okay, well, fair enough. Let's say that work is rubbish. But that then means that you're not actually enjoying your Sunday night either, because you're worrying about something that may day. And Buddhism has this big emphasis of saying, you know what, all that exists right now is this, what you're experiencing. So focus on that. And again, you can find all of this, I think, if you dig around enough in Christian spiritual traditions, but often seeing it from that fresh context, I found that really sort of helpful.
So sounds like what you can pull out of Ecclesiastes in some aspects. That's kind of what I find Ecclesiastes helpful is you're mortal. Don't dwell too much in the future, because you can't control it. Everything's just like smoke, meaningless, vapor, futile, whatever translation you've got of Hevel. And so live in the now and know that this now is what God has given you. So that does sound similar to what you've taken from that, and helpful and a fresh perspective. Sorry, Dan, do you have a question?
No, I was going to say, it was just interesting listening to you talking about how within the sort of Christian tradition we have this idea of pride, being one of the sort of 7 deadly sins, and Buddhism thinks it's in different terms, in terms of the ego. So obviously, in some sense, actually, religions don't necessarily get us to the same the top of the same mountain, but they do point in the same direction. So they do get a few. If we're talking about God is at the top of the staircase, actually some of the religions do seem to go up. We're like, oh hi, you're on the same step as us. We're on the way up. Are there other examples of that? Things where there are certain religions that are closer to the top of the staircase than others, and
so just coming back to the point about the Buddhism and the ego, I think that is a good illustration of the points of caution too. So the Buddhists and certain sects of Hindus both are suspicious of the ego, which we are also suspicious of the ego or pride. But there is an important difference, which is the Buddhists are suspicious of the ego because you do not exist, according to Buddhism, in the way that you think you do.
Mm.
And there's a sense in which you don't really exist, and you're just part of this ultimate reality. And likewise, for certain sects of Hinduism, ultimately you're part of Brahman, its ultimate reality, and you don't exist as a distinct entity. And so, although they're suspicious of the ego and they'll help you overcome that, don't go too far, or by all means study them from an intellectual perspective, but be aware that some of the philosophical underpinnings of that are quite different. And so you have got to go in with your eyes open, and you've got to be aware of what Christianity does teach, which is that, and there's different models for it, but that in some way or form you have a soul and you do exist as a separate entity. So you've got to be clear on that, so that you can see, okay, hold on, I can use them, but only up to a certain point. In terms of other religions, the two other ones that I've found helpful personally, but a lot of that's probably telling you about my psychology. Sikhism, I think the Guru Granth Sahib, which is their holy text, has some absolutely beautiful prayers in it, and there are most of them where you can read it as a Christian, you can affirm all of it. You don't need to be suspicious of it. There are some bits, where you need to be. You'd either need to reinterpret it or you couldn't affirm it. But there are certainly some prayers where you read it and you could put that in the Bible, and I don't think anybody would notice. I don't think people would realize that wasn't. You put in alongside some of the Psalms, change some of the words a little bit. I don't think anybody would notice. So Sikhism, and then I would also say Taoism. For me, recently, I love a bit of the Chinese sort of philosophy, religious sort of worldview. Taoism, you might have heard of it described as Taoism or the Tao and things like that. The same sort of tradition that brought about Tai Chi. They have, again, there are points of disagreement. So they have the Tao, which is the way, and that's an impersonal force which guides the universe and all of us towards its ultimate good. It's impersonal. It's not God as we would understand it. But in many ways, they have a very similar relationship with the Tao that we might have with God. So they have a sense of surrender, because the Tao will win in the end, and you can either fight against it, try and swim upstream, or you can just go with the flow, which is where you're going to end up eventually anyway. And then trusting that ultimately the Tao is going to bring about things for the ultimate good. And of course, that's what, I can't remember where it is, but it says in Scripture that God will turn all things to our good. Again, there's nuance there, because there's different Taoist thinkers, and some really do kind of put the Tao is just kind of nature, it's the universe. Some kind of have the Tao as the principle of nature, a little bit outside it. So they themselves are disagreeing. But there's lots of it there that you can kind of read and benefit from. And again, if you read some of their texts, some of them are really beautiful, because they kind of poke fun at a lot of our, shall we say, human values. So for the Taoists, for example, there's a major suspicion of power and social prestige and excessive striving after money. And much like for the Buddhists, there's an emphasis on just living in the now, enjoying the free things, and a great suspicion of ego and of excessive hierarchy. And, I for one, like all people, get healthy ambition, but like all people, sometimes that creeps into something a bit unhealthy, a desire to be better than others. And the Taoists are really good at kind of poking fun at that. They recognize those desires in themselves and in others, and then they poke fun at them. And so it can be really refreshing to read through. And you find yourself sort of chuckling along, going, oh yeah, I am a bit like that, but I see that I shouldn't be.
Yeah, this really, and Christianity does that to some extent. There's this sort of blend of humility and confidence to be held in tension, but the confidence is in Christ, and that should keep us humble. But again, having that foundation, because it's common. I might be wrong in this, but in Buddhism, there's a sense of losing yourself, isn't there, to completely become one with everything else. So yourself isn't actually necessarily valuable. Is that a right interpretation of that?
Yeah. So for traditional Buddhism, and again, there's lots of different denominations, and some of them mix it in with Hindu beliefs and indigenous folk religions. Mm-hmm. If you kind of take, well, maybe they would object to me describing that. If you take pure Buddhism, going back to what the Buddha taught, he subscribed to what's called a bundle theory of the self. Okay, and what that says is all that you are is a collection of properties, but there's nothing having those properties. So there is a body, and that's got various parts attached to it. There is thought, there is feeling, there is sense experience. There's all of that, but there's no I having those sense experiences. That's an illusion. And so what the sort of quest for enlightenment is to see that as an illusion. And what you then discover is actually you're not separate to everything else. You're just one particular bit of an enormous whole. In a sense, there isn't a you. And so have either of you guys seen The Good Place?
Yes.
I keep hearing about it, but I've not watched it yet.
He's describing the wave on the ocean. That's a Buddhist metaphor, right? Really, you're just a wave on the ocean. And the wave could think, oh, I'm separate to the ocean, and I'm going to strive and hold myself together and try and avoid going back into the ocean because I'm a separate thing, and I'm going to worry about myself and keep myself big. Or the wave could go, actually, you know what? I'm just water, just like everything else. I'm not really a distinct thing, and I'm just going to let go, and then I'm going to dissolve back into the ocean, which is all I ever really truly was. And that's what Chidi is talking about. This idea that really we're just parts of the universe. We kind of cling together, trying to hold ourselves in existence. But if we can learn to sort of let go, we'll find release and freedom, and we'll become one with everything. And so, as you can see, though, there are bits of that where, as Christians, we would nod along, like suspicion of the ego and of becoming lesser for us so that God can become greater. But you do need to draw back from some of the final bits. You couldn't, because, for example, if you want to believe in a personal afterlife, you're not going to get that in Buddhism. No. Because what happens is you dissolve back into ultimate reality. whole point for the Buddhists is, interestingly, is part of you goes, no, I don't want to die. I don't want to go back into reality. Well, that's because you're living under the illusion that you already exist, which according to Buddhists, you don't, not in the way you think you do, until you overcome it, and then you. So and that's what you may have heard people talking about Buddhist nihilism and things like that. There is a sort of degree of almost suicidalness to Buddhism.
Is a view like that sort of falsifiable? Because it seems, at least to a Western person, seems incredibly counterintuitive to think of oneself as not a self.
So it wouldn't be falsifiable on scientific grounds. All you'd ever do, for example, if that's what you mean by falsifiable, because all you would ever be doing in the science is picking up a particular property. So you could measure a body, or you could measure a brain wave, and the Buddhists would go, yeah, there are brain waves, there are bodies. There's just nobody having the brain waves and having the body. So they're making a higher level conceptual claim. Whether there are philosophical ways of demonstrating that it's false, well, that kind of takes you right up into debates that have been raging for, thousands of years. Yeah. I can't give you a nice, neat answer.
That's fine. No,
I guess my take, though, would be you've either got to be Buddhist in terms of your concept of the self, or you've got to be, I'll say, Abrahamic in terms of your concept of the self. Either there is a self, and it's actually going to have some pretty quirky properties, like it may in fact be immaterial and immortal, at least in elements of it. That then leads us on to Aristotelian mystic philosophy and all sorts. But I think that's one option. Or, I think you could subscribe to the bundle theory, but then you're going to have to go all the way and become a proper Buddhist. So I have a sort of grudging respect for them. Like, actually, if I didn't subscribe to this view of personhood, I'd subscribe to that view, but I don't.
Yeah. So you said the word Abrahamic. So that might be a good sort of segue to maybe talking about how Christians should view the other Abrahamic religions. Are they completely false? Are there, why is it worth spending our time trying to understand them? Should we just focus on Christianity? Is there any value in really studying and looking for what's good within them?
Before we go into that, because that's a really important question. Sorry, I'm just going to explain to those listening on the podcast and those not in the UK at the moment that the fireworks in the background are because we're recording this on bonfire night. So if you hear any popping, it's fireworks going on. We're not under attack. But just to let you know that that's going on in the background of probably all three of us at various points in time. Sorry. So great question, Dan. So going into Abrahamic faiths, how do we handle them? Richard, over to you.
Well, you may well know more about this than me, because you've really got more of a background in theology as opposed to philosophy. But I guess off the bat, what I would say is you've definitely got to take Judaism seriously, because one could argue that Christianity is an absolutely enormous Jewish sect. That's how it was first perceived, and you can't understand the Old Testament without understanding Judaism. You can't understand most of Jesus' claims without understanding Judaism's and their expectations about the Messiah and about the end times and things like that. So you've absolutely got to take Judaism really seriously. And I know that one of the debates that rages in contemporary Christian theology, and it's one of the things that the Catholics were very interested in the context of Vatican II, for example, should we be proselytizing the Jews? Because there are some Christians who think that we shouldn't, because they say the Old Testament covenant, the Old Covenant, is still in place, and if it's working for them, leave them to it. And if they want to come over to the New Covenant, so to speak, I'm sure I'm theologically committing some error here, but you get what I'm driving at. So they would actually say, no, in a sense, Judaism is completely true, even in its sort of current form. And now that's obviously open to debate. There are some Christians, I think, who would hate that idea and would say, no, we need to proselytize to them as much as we do any other religion. But the point is, we can't just ignore them, because they are very closely related to us, theologically. And then I would say that in Islam, there's less of a need to study it because we don't need to understand Islam per se to understand our own tradition. But I would say if you're not at least open, or as maybe so we say as a religious community, if we're not open to studying Islamic thought, you do miss out on some pretty good gems. So I teach a module on medieval Islamic thought, and mostly that's on the medieval Islamic philosophy. You may have heard of the Islamic Golden Age, when they were leading the world in terms of medicine and philosophy and theology and all of that sort of thing. And some of their philosophy is absolutely, I mean, whether it works or not, we can debate, but some of it is really, really interesting. On a par with the work, the work of Avicenna is on a par with the work of Aquinas, I would say. And so, and a lot of the arguments as Christians we can just accept as apologetic arguments. And so, you've got William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, right? Well, that comes from Muslim theology or Muslim philosophy. So if you just disregarded that, we wouldn't have that gem. I would definitely say, certainly for me, I would say the Muslim philosophy has been helpful. I haven't engaged so much with other elements of it personally. Whether that continues, I don't know. But
engaging with the sort of Islamic side of things is often interesting from the perspective of what they've picked up on from potentially Christian sects at that time, later on down the line in Christian history. Just hearing, you can kind of see it in the Quran, that there's some basic understanding of Trinitarian theology, but not quite there. And so understanding, and that's the go-to for Muslims when they're attacking Christian faith is the Trinity generally. And so having some understanding of what they think and why that's an incorrect understanding of Trinity is an interesting way to go. I've found it really, really helpful to engage with Judaism more, and I'm very fortunate to be able to chat to a very well-read and great guy who's a rabbi, and he's heads up the chaplaincy team, and we have a holy book club that we read bit from the Quran or the Hadiths, a bit from the Hebrew Bible, and a bit from the New Testament. And we kind of go through different themes, and listening to, obviously, the Hebrew Bible and the explanation that goes alongside it from a Jew is quite amazing. It's like, oh, okay. And I've watched a couple YouTube clips where you've got sort of evangelicals interacting with Jews, and it's fascinating watching evangelicals squirm because they just don't understand the Old Testament. They don't understand the rich history of tradition that and how Jews interpret the scriptures, and then as you say, how we then understand Jesus's claims, how we even understand our own translations, comes into an understanding of what's come before Christianity and what Christianity is really built up of. So I've, in my own faith, I've found that incredibly refreshing to engage with that, and where you've got random but also challenging passages, like you've got the Psalm where it says "kiss the Son," and people are like, "Hey, look, it's Jesus in the Psalms," and you're like, "Well, no, actually." You start listening a little bit more, and you realize actually it's a bad translation, most likely to be about homage, and then you start having to really unpick and go, well, okay, if that's not Jesus in the Psalms, and Jesus is in the Psalms, I do believe that there are verses and passages and chapters where it's very much pointing to a crucifixion, in my understanding. But wrestling with that and wrestling with someone who disagrees with you is really vital and healthy, I think, for getting that grounding.
You're spot on. I'm glad you brought that up, because I love reading like Jewish thinkers. Like, one of my favorite thinkers is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. I think he's an amazing philosopher and theologian, sort of just public intellectual. And he, the way he opens up the Old Testament scriptures is just, I think, should be mandatory for Christians to just read, Jewish commentators on the Old Testament. And the point you made about the Psalms, when it's talking about kiss the Son, one of the risks as Christians have this tendency, obviously in some sense we should, but reading the Bible Christocentrically. So we're but to the point that some Christians are trying to find him where he isn't, and being very creative in the way they're looking at certain Old Testament scriptures. And you read a lot of apologetics work sometimes that's looking for these, these prophecies of Christ in the Old Testament. And a lot of them they're just wrong. They're embarrassingly wrong. There's there is some great stuff in there, especially in Isaiah. That's why we call it people talk about it as the fifth gospel. But in a lot of places, it's a real stretch, and it's our commitment to trying to find Christ in there that we create him in places where that's just not the case. And I think you just read some Jewish commentaries and listen to some Jewish thinkers, and you realize, oh no, I think they're right. And the case in point is the one you mentioned, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of where to go from here. So we need to find somewhere where we disagree, because it then means that the conversation goes.
I've got one for Richard. So this is right. So Richard, what are you sort of, in terms of, we all agree that there's good things in other religions, and there are things that are true in other religions. But in terms of when people talk about sort of inclusivism, so there's sort of inclusivism, pluralism on the other end, and exclusivism. Okay, so if we look at other religions, like what's your kind of view on those things? So we can agree you seem pluralism is false. In terms of sort of soteriological inclusivism or exclusivism, are there some people that who have never heard of Christ, somewhere on an island in the Pacific somewhere, they're worshipping their deity, but actually a theological inclusivist could say, well, actually maybe if they had heard of Christ, if someone had told them, so actually they're worshipping Christ ontologically, they just don't know it. So someone like Karl Rahner would say, they're anonymous Christians. So they don't know they're Christians, but actually they are worshipping Christ. So what do you think about it? Because that's when I think a lot of Christians become very uncomfortable with that notion. And I think, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, so when I first became a Christian, it was in an evangelical context, and then I moved into an Anglican context, and now I'm beginning to move into more almost a Catholic context. Well, no, a Catholic context now. That's like I attend a Catholic church now. And sort of the official line of the Catholic Church is an inclusivist line, and that particular element of it, I've always instinctively felt, even when I was an evangelical, I've always found exclusivism. I think it can be made logically coherent. I agree, it's an intellectual possibility, and I know that William Lane Craig has done a sort of, in the same way that Planting has responded with a defense to the problem of evil, being the free will defense, Craig's done a defense of the problem of the unevangelized, explaining how it can be just that those who have never heard the gospel are damned, even though it looks like on the face of it they could never have accepted the gospel through no fault of their own. And yeah, I agree. He's got a way of understanding that whereby, exclusivism is not incompatible with the goodness and love of God. I agree. But still, I find that deeply intuitively and emotionally unsatisfying. And certainly when I read about people of other faiths and other religions, some of them, it seems to me, they were onto something. They had something. When you hear about the lives of some of the Sikh gurus, now I'm not a historian here, so I don't know how those are probably being given to us through rose-tinted glasses is probably a story that the Sikhs want to tell us. Okay, but if even half of what they say about some of the gurus is true, this absolute love of God, this absolute love of mankind, belief in absolute equality between men and women and between the different races and castes, and an absolute submittance to God's will, I sort of think I just can't personally get my head around the idea of him arriving at the pearly gates and God going, yeah, but you didn't affirm the Trinity in the right way. I just can't get because most Christians don't really. Most Christians are modalists. If you talk to them about it, most Christians don't understand the Trinity deep down. And so again, when you read about some of the Taoists, they had this utter peace and love about them, and I just think, okay, is it possible? Yeah, okay, it's possible that they're all damned because, and we can make some distinction between the natural revelation and the so on, and revealed theology, and we can do all of that, but I don't know. On the face of it, and my perspective is limited, but on the face of it, they look like they're more holy than me. So if they don't stand a chance, then I certainly don't stand a chance. So I at least need to be open to that possibility. And
so just
a satisfying place to be, personally.
So just going back to so my understanding of William Lane Craig is he would say, because he's an exclusivist, his understanding is that we're in the best possible world, so where the greatest number of people would have been exposed, would have heard the gospel. And so those that wouldn't have heard the gospel in any possible universe, or something akin to that. Yeah, I can't remember. It's been years since I've looked at that.
Off the top of my head, and I don't want to misrepresent him, but off the top of my head, I think he distinguishes between something like what he calls the natural revelation of God in the natural world, and then sort of revelation of God through the gospel. And what he says is everybody who would say yes to either the natural revelation or the gospel, God foreknows that they will say yes to either the natural revelation or the gospel, and places them in either a Christian or a Jewish context, depending on the Old New Testament. And everybody then who didn't hear the gospel would have rejected it had they heard it, and he also thinks they've rejected the natural revelation of God. So when they arrive at the pearly gates, not only they can turn around to God and say, well, I never heard the gospel, so I could never say yes. That's true, but you also explicitly rejected the natural revelation. And that's the second bit I just don't buy. There are some thinkers out there from other, again, I've been reading Chang Tzu and Lao Tzu recently, two Taoist thinkers. It seems to me they got about as close to Christianity as you can get without the gospel, purely by, well, I don't know. I don't know how they did it. Some form of
revelation, maybe.
One wonders whether God might have given them a hint. Whether there was some inner spirit, shall we say, sent by God to prompt them towards saying things that are quite. And so just for me, that's where I always come back to. I think that's. I think that's correct. Dan, is that right? Match up what you.
That sounds. That sounds right from what I've got on William Craig's sort of thing. I think for me, not to go on any camp, I think the Bible is quite. It doesn't really explore that too much in detail. The people that have not heard. There's the space in there for potential. Like you can dig in if you want, but for me, it's reliance on God's character as revealed through Scripture, which is that He is just, He is merciful. It's on His grace that we lean fully to have access to the tree of life, to immortality through Christ. We seek immortality through Him, and so I mean I'm not Catholic, so as a Protestant, I'd be very much justification by faith, and that whole conversation is for another day, but very much see a lot of overlap between the two camps of Protestantism and Catholicism, but I think for the sort of other religions and those that have not heard the gospel, I don't think I'm satisfied with William Lane Craig's response. and I think there is space for, and maybe I'm stretching things a little bit further, but from my reading, there's a space that people will respond to God at some point. They will meet God, and they will be able to respond to Him in full.
There's definitely a presumption in the Bible that everyone needs to hear the gospel. That does seem like you read Acts. There is that presumption there, is that everyone needs to hear the gospel. And like you said, there's so many unanswered questions. From that, does it follow that exclusivism is true? Because I can see where the issues of justice coming is, well, if someone in a remote part of the world would have responded to the gospel if they'd heard it, but no one ever shares it with them, then there is a sense in which that seems obviously unjust. If that is an ultimate requirement, for salvation, and so that William Lane Craig sort of his argument is an attempt to try and resolve that, isn't it? That this sense that that's not, we can understand that in a way that is not unjust, and this is one of those questions I've stopped giving too much thought, because there's we don't know, because you're right. What William Crane Lake's argument is a pretty tight philosophical case. It can make sense, but there is a sense in which it seems, again, just because it's uncomfortable doesn't, it's not true. But people who appear to love God, live sacrificially, but they could be completely mistaken. There's a innate sort of uncomfortableness that I think a lot of people have. I don't really know. I was just interested to see what people thought, really, and what's the difference between the sort of, because I think one of the criticisms that people level against inclusivism is that what's the real difference between inclusivism and pluralism, really, in a sense. Because you can say on one hand, say, oh yeah, Christ is unique. Absolutely, Christ is the one you find at the top of the mountain. But it pragmatically, it seems very, very similar.
Well, but I've never. But just from a pragmatic point of view, both theories allow for the possibility that you arrive up in heaven and there'd be people of lots of different faiths there, but the mechanism by which they're getting there, the sort of ontology of it all, is completely different, and that's it's still, no inclusivist is denying, because if they're denying this, they're not an inclusivist, they're a pluralist. No inclusivist is denying that everybody is saved through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. They're not denying that, and that definitely makes them inclusivists, not pluralists, because pluralists would hold that whatever story that particular religion tells, that's how they get into heaven. But inclusivists would explicitly deny that. So there's in practical terms, in terms of what you see when you arrive at the pearly gates, there may not be much difference, but there's a heck of a difference beneath the surface, and that's important. And the other distinction I sort of hear people levying against inclusivists is that it removes the sort of need to spread the gospel. I think that's a better argument, but I still don't see why it would remove the need in sort of entirely, shall we say. There'd still be a pressing need, because people still need to know about the good news now, and they still want to dedicate their lives. But this life still matters, and if we can get to know God now, then that's still a good thing. Similarly, inclusivists shouldn't rule out the possibility that some people might be saved because they hear the gospel. They would just say it's possible that those who haven't heard the gospel have been saved. And so and similarly also, it sort of seems to me that, I'll be cautious here, but it seems to me that one could push back and say, actually, the problem with exclusivism is it puts too much of the burden on us saving ourselves. Because all of a sudden it's down to my efforts, up to me to go and save that person. Well, that's not about the grace of God. primacy of grace. It's God who saves us. And so, yeah, he invites us to participate in that process. But if the burden is all on us, you've literally got to spread it to absolutely everybody.
Yeah.
I have some, I can see where they're coming from with this idea that it makes the need to spread the gospel less pressing. I can see that. But I don't think it would, in as much as I do evangelize, make me do it more or less beside that debate I came down on.
I think it's, again, for me, it's just sitting in the middle. I don't tend to label myself inclusive, exclusive. Maybe I'm a bit of both. It's the same with how I sit on the Arminian Calvinism sort of fence. I try not to label. I see that the Bible holds these things in tension somewhat, and so I kind of try and fit my theology in that tension. That we're called to go and share the gospel and the good news, while also reliant on God's grace and mercy for those who we don't necessarily reach, because it's not about us doing that. I'm aware of time, and there's a few questions in the chat. Just to I'm not sure we're going to hit all of them, as we've not got.
I think the first one was about what we think is the strongest philosophical argument for God.
Let's start there. So I had to scroll back up. Yeah. So what argument for God's existence do you think is the strongest?
That's a bit boring, but I do like the argument. I do like that one. That's one of my favorites. I think that that being said, I'm a Thomist myself, an Aristotelian / Thomist. And so I do think Aquinas' 5 ways are, I think on purely philosophical grounds, they might even be stronger than the Kalam cosmological arguments. I think, unlike the Kalam cosmological argument, they get you to the classical God of theism, rather than just some form of creator God. I think that in terms of the sort of gut punch of the argument and how persuasive it is for, your average person on the street, if you're trying to give them rattle off a quick argument to show them the plausibility of the Christian faith, then I think the Kalam cosmological argument takes some beating. But I think all Christians should definitely study Aquinas' 5 ways. And I'd say all 5, they're difficult. The first 3 are relatively straightforward. You can get your head around those relatively quickly, I would say. I have got a video on that on my YouTube channel if you want to watch it, and I will do some more at some stage. The 5th way is a little bit harder, but again, when it clicks into place, it's like, actually, that's a really good argument. And about a year or 2 ago, I finally got my head around the 4th way, and actually, that's a really good argument. And they really do get you to the classical God of theism, not just some creator God. And so I think, in some ways, they're philosophically stronger, even if from the point of view of apologetics, they're less effective because they're more complicated.
I think, just to point, I started listening to your Aquinas. I started it. I haven't finished it, but it's very accessible. At least the starting point is the way you're presenting it and the sort of interaction with the person that you're talking to, how they're being the student. I thought that was quite a nice little setup. Another question comes through just in the fact that you're now part of a Catholic church. What's led you into that direction? Was it specific philosophers, or you see the question on the screen?
Yeah, so my PhD supervisor was David Oderberg, who's also a well-known Catholic philosopher who's very good friends with Fessa. So they had a big influence on my philosophical development, and then I ended up becoming a Thomist. And then if you guys want to have another conversation about it at some stage, I'll happily come on and talk about it. But I guess what I ended up continually having Catholics come into my life, even though I was evangelical and an Anglican. There's endless Catholics, just endless. I was working with them, I was studying with them. And so that just kept me having a debate. And one of the things that I eventually decided and still think and still hold, actually the differences are not as big as you think they are. I noticed you talked about justification by faith alone. There's a sense, and I need to be really careful here, there's a sense in which Catholics can affirm that. It's about the fulfillment of faith. what we both emphasize, for example, though, is the primacy of grace. And so when you kind of dig into it, you discover actually, no, hold on, a sophisticated Protestant theology and a sophisticated Catholic theology, they're actually pretty similar. There's a few moving parts, but they're in the same sort of ballpark. And so I discovered that actually I kind of agree with most of what the Catholics say on most things. And then the final sorts of issues was the Mary stuff and some stuff about the authority, sort of teaching authority of the church, what gives the church that authority. And I won't go into that now, partly because I can't do it all off the top of my head. I would say Dr. Brandt Peter does some really good stuff on Mary.
He's a great New Testament
I think it's called Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary. He's got some really good stuff. And then I read a book by a woman called Linda Zagzebski. She's an American.
Yeah, she's a great scholar, yeah.
And she wrote a book about epistemic authority, which I think is called Epistemic Authority. And in the end, I decided that actually the gist of it is that we're being called, and that the epistemically smart thing to do is to do it as a community. So the question is, which community can trace its origins back to the apostles? And then I think the short answer is, if you're Protestant, you trace it back to the Reformation. If you're Catholic or Orthodox, you're in with a shout. And I'll leave it there. But it was those sorts of arguments. Ultimately, there's a sense, I'd say, I hasten to add, the sense in which I don't think it matters so much, the sense in which the difference is, in a sense, I now don't care as much as I used to, because I don't think that the differences, as I said, between a sophisticated Protestant and Catholic theology are actually that significant. But those are the broad strokes. And if you guys want to have me on again at some stage, I'll need to brush up on some of it, because some of it's rusty in my head, and some of it's not my primary field, but I'd happily do my best.
Yeah, talk about Catholicism and the 5 ways. It would be good. I often, because I have a real interest, like I'm a big fan of the Jesuits, and like I always try and read like the case. I've got like close family. My grandparents are Roman Catholics, and I always try and read like what's the best case for Catholicism. And so I've read stuff like books by Trent Horn and Scott Hahn. And like, I always find it's always the same. I read I get about halfway and I'm like, no, I'm on board. Yeah, I agree. And then it just gets to a point I'm like, no, this is weird, but I can see how you get here. And then the last third of all the books, I'm like, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. I just can't. I can't land there. And it's just funny because it's the same in every book. I'm like, no, I can do this. I'm going to become a Catholic. And then it just drifts further and further away towards the end. It's like Mary, and there's praying to saints and some other stuff. But I'm not going to get into it now. But it's just funny because it just always happens.
I guess the only thing I'd say, although you're as experienced in all this as I am, and you're a smart guy, I don't want to patronize you, but that's kind of the situation I was. And I'd say if you keep going, which is what I did, keep going, one day you'll get to the end of the book and you'll be like, wait a minute.
Wait, I do think the Pope is infallible. Wait,
I got to the end of the books and I was like, yeah. And that I then had a major mental breakdown for about 3 days because I couldn't cope with the fact that I might be a Catholic. I just had these visions. I thought, Catholics are weird. I can't be a Catholic. But yeah, that was about a year ago now, and I'm still going.
Still going. Still love Jesus.
God hasn't struck me down yet, so.
yeah. Well, yeah, it's good to know actually, because it is good having these conversations, and so yeah, very much for having that conversation. I mean, we're talking about other religions as it is, so it's only helpful.
yeah, we're just broadening it.
Denominations, I mean.
Of course, just be teasing. There's this question here from the programmer. As a self-learning layman with a 9 to 5, which books would you recommend for the layman to start on philosophy and biblical studies?
Well, I won't weigh in on the biblical studies book because that's not my area of expertise. In terms of the philosophy, again, very boring, but you good place to start is with William Lane Craig. He's got a lot of lots of introduction to apologetics, odd, reasonable faith, books like that. And you can watch his debates and you can look at his free articles. And then I would say that when you begin to feel more comfortable with his sort of arguments, then I would say enter the world of Aquinas and people like that. Do that through people like Fesser. So Fesser's got a book called Aquinas: An Introduction. A little bit, I would say that's kind of a step up. But start with Fesser and then Aquinas, and then actually once you've mastered that, then you can actually move into some pretty high level academic stuff. And you can read really academic books written for an academic audience. So I would say, start with Craig stuff. Start with books like On Guard. Look at his debates. Look at some of his free articles on the internet. Then move on to Reasonable Faith, and then step up to Fesser. And I say this because this is kind of the route that I took, although I did this as part of my studies. But and then Fesser, start with Fesser's sort of stuff aimed at undergraduates and at the lay audience, such as Aquinas: An Introduction, and then you can move up to his sort of An Introduction to Scholastic Metaphysics, and then you're away. And then you can come and teach me, to be honest, that stage.
That's cool. Biblical studies wise, I'm entry level still. That's something that I'd like to dig into a little bit more, but I've found John Walton particularly helpful and accessible with his Lost World books. And that's pretty much, I've done a bit of Michael Heiser.
Okay, I guess I would say I have read some N.T. Wright.
Yes, love N.T. Wright.
Seems persuasive to me.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. N.T. Wright is in. I've read some stuff by him, and that's probably the most academic stuff. And then, Lee Strobel does quite a. It's a lay introduction, but it's quite a nice way of thinking in those sorts of ways. So
yeah, and if you're talking about lay people to get you stuck into just keeping it accessible as well, but also well grounded, someone like John Stott is also helpful for accessing. Lee Strobel, as we've said before on this podcast, is very much a sort of gateway to loads of other people just through his interviews and things like that. So even if you're not sure about where Lee stands, it's the access to the other names. Dan, have you got any names on the biblical studies front?
I do on biblical studies, I always find like the IVP Bible background commentaries. I think are really good from a sort of biblical studies perspective, because just helps you can't really understand the Bible if you don't understand the sort of culture and who it was originally written for, and written for all of us, but to different people. And so I think that they're usually quite helpful. I think and there's a New Testament one that's edited by Craig Keener, I think, and an Old Testament one that's John Walton and a couple of other people I can't quite remember, but they're really great resources.
For the New Testament wise, there's Kenneth Bailey is good. The Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. Well, there's a just new source recommending that.
There's a New Testament book which I think is like going to be it's the big thing at the moment with N.T. Wright and who's the Australian New Testament scholar?
Oh, I saw that. I heard it on.
Yeah, that's. I haven't read it, but I've listened to him talk about it on a podcast. I know it's become very, very popular quite quickly, and there's a DVD series that goes along with it. That for New Testament, that would be if you could only get one book other than the Bible for the New Testament.
It's something Theology, but I can't remember what it's called.
I can't remember it, and I can't remember his name. If you talk, I'm going to find it on Amazon.
Yeah, you do that. So thanks for those questions. There's one more question here for you, Richard. I'm aware that we are close to our final question time. Have you got time for one more question before our final question?
Let's go for it.
So what do you think of the argument for God's existence using the applicability of mathematics? I think I was speaking out of my... that was an interesting one there on the chat.
This is the same guy though who was asking about entry-level philosophy books.
Yeah, I think he's just trying to keep us talking. I think he's trying to keep us talking. This is their that's also what came up with let's keep firing questions in, so they have to keep going. So there's that. The programmer and London Theist are often on the chat, so They're very good friends of the show.
Oh, hi, London Theist.
Yeah, no, he was on the show a couple shows ago. So yeah, good to chat with Dean. So yeah, are you aware of? I'm not sure where Dan's gone at the moment. Oh, he's just having problems with his camera. Are you aware of this argument? Have you?
Yeah. So I'm not. I know again that Craig's been doing some work on it recently, and I know that the gist of the argument is it starts from the observation that mathematics is a very good way of describing the physical world, and that's where our whole sort of scientific discipline of physics comes from, and that is quite a remarkable thing if the universe is just a sort of mindless brute fact. It suggests that it was designed to be intelligible, and that suggests there's a designer and an intelligible mind behind it. And so in that sense, it seems to me it's part of that great tradition of sort of teleological style arguments. And I would say, yeah, I'm absolutely open to those sorts of arguments. I think they're onto something. And I think the fact that the universe, and you often see atheists, I've seen Christians use this argument against atheists, and they often kind of dismiss it, but actually it's a really interesting observation, which most ancient societies didn't make, and other world religions don't make it. At least, I mean, now they kind of got some of it from us, from the West, from the scientific method that developed over here. So now they do. But if you look at it in their philosophy, a lot of Eastern thought didn't think that the world was intelligible. They didn't think that ultimately it could be understood or broken down or conceptualized. But it is, and it can be, and the evidence of that is the success of science. And that is a really interesting feature that cries out for some form of explanation, because why on earth would that be if it was all just blind, mindless chance? Why would the world behave in a regular law-like way? And why would, even if you can explain that, why would some apes who emerged, on the Sahara 200,000 years ago, who were a bit smarter than the other apes, why would we all of a sudden be able to unlock that? And that's got to get you thinking, at the very least. So I'm not an expert in it, but I absolutely think it would be a fruitful and interesting thing to study more at some stage. When I get the time, at some stage, I will read up on that more. But instinctively, it strikes me as a good starting point.
Yeah, unless your rationality rules and you think you've debunked Craig in a 15-20 minute video, there's always that. Just another YouTuber. If you haven't come across him, don't worry. But yeah, there's a channel that thinks it's debunked already. So yeah, and anything else you want to add, Dan, before we close to our last question?
No, I mean, there's so much. The good thing about talking about you, which is you have a lot of expertise in other areas and stuff. There's also pro-life stuff as well. The 5 ways would be a great thing to talk about. The Catholicism thing as well. So I think we'll definitely have to get you back. And I apologise for some of the left field questions of this. It's just that it's one of those, when it comes to different religions, it's one of those things that I kind of think about, but no one really talks about it very often. It's not like at church we talk about, people talk about how we understand different religions. So you're kind of left to think about. And I think it's often one of those topics where a lot of Christians end up having some quite strange beliefs, because Christians don't really talk about it. There's sort of, unless everyone's a sort of rabid exclusivist, but culturally pluralism is kind of the view that a lot of people embrace. It's interesting. There's this alternative, inclusivism is kind of a way that almost takes the best elements of both in a way, and is still can be faithful to Scripture, and philosophically robust as well. But I don't think I have anything to add other than, it's really interesting. I think you've made me want to look into Taoism a little bit more. And I have to be honest, when it comes to reading Buddhism and Hinduism, I genuinely, that was only last week, I was reading a book, I think it's by Christopher, I can't remember, Taliaferro, a philosopher, I can't remember his name. And he wrote
I think it's Charles, isn't it? Charles Taliaferro,
yeah. And it's St. Olaf's College or something where he's from, and on philosophy of religion, and had like chapters on Hinduism and Buddhism. And I really had to push through, because I can't, once I start a book, even if I'm not enjoying it, I have to carry on. And I just found it. I got lost, because it's so foreign in a philosophical sense. Like, I just find it so difficult to get my head around. Like, and I don't enjoy reading it, because it just doesn't. It doesn't feel like it has any relevance. Like, I'm like, oh, I really appreciate that, and listening how there's no self, and I just think, I just don't believe that, and it's really difficult to probe too much further, because it just seems absurd on a surface level, and I think maybe a lot of Christians find that to be, well, some obviously don't, but I think maybe a lot do, where there's something about studying Islam and Judaism that seems a little bit closer to home.
Yeah, start with what you find interesting. I mean, if it doesn't feed you spiritually, intellectually, or what have you, then don't do it. But I would say that there's some really good stuff out there, and I would recommend Taoism. I love a bit of Taoism.
That's really
I'm always, I never want to say, I would never say something like I'm a Christian Taoist, because I hate it when people do that. You can't combine two.
It doesn't work.
But there's a little bit of me like, yeah, I'm a Christian Taoist. But I'm not saying that.
Yeah. No, we're not putting those labels. That's yeah.
That'll be the YouTube tag, Christian Taoist, Richard Playford.
I'll put it into the description, just as he's described himself as. And it's been really interesting, and I find, one thing that I've found really enlightening, even in the last few years in engaging with international students, is finding the strongest arguments for the religions that you're engaging with, but doing so. I really like how you put it at the start, cautiously, doing so cautiously, having the best Christian thinkers as your friends in the form of their books, if they're dead, or if you can get in touch with them, do so. But have the best Christian thinkers around you while you engage with these other religions, and see how to critique them, how to engage with them well, not just sort of take in hook, line, and sinker. And with things like, I completely understand what you're saying there, Dan, with things like Hinduism. I struggle with just trying to get my head around how can multiple things be true, because that's pretty much the concept for Hinduism is, and talking to Hindu students, they'll be like, oh, this is great, tell me about your faith, and I'm quite happy to set up a shrine to Jesus alongside my shrine to whichever God, and then you go, well, that's not how Jesus works. It just doesn't. How can I relate to that is really difficult, and then trying to wrestle with that. But I found that there's quite a few books out there that are written by Christians about another religion, and to be honest, I'm very critical of those books, because they'll often paint a very they won't let the religion speak for itself. In some ways, it's I can't give you too much of this religion because you might find it too interesting, so I'm going to just tame it for you and then present it, and then so it's going into it cautiously, but finding strong arguments so you don't end up misrepresenting others is really key. Last question, and any final comments, Richard, and then we'll let you go. Resources, people we should know of that haven't been discussed already. Maybe your sort of go-to top 3 or 5, depending on how quick you want to be.
Okay.
Just sort of like, favorite books you think Christians to read, or maybe Christian thinkers, or they don't have to be Christian thinkers that we, people might not have heard of, but would benefit from listening to, engaging with.
And a good intro to Taoism.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
So Taoism, there's a book called The Way of Changzhu, which is by Thomas Merton. Now, Thomas Merton was a Catholic friar or monk of some stripe or other at the early 20th century. And he was very interested in Eastern religions. And towards the end of his life, he maybe went a little bit off the deep end and maybe did drift too much into a bit of syncretism. And so some people are a bit suspicious of him. But he's got a lot of good stuff. And one of them is called The Way of Changzu. And he's basically, there's a book called Chinese philosopher called Changzu. And there are different translations of it. And what he did for sort of poetic reasons is he took highlights of the different translations that he liked. He had a kind of a smattering of the Chinese himself, but mostly he just took, like, that translation really speaks to me, that translation really speaks to me. So it's more a book of poetry, little extracts, and it's about 150 pages of pithy little poems, usually no more than a page or two. And they might be anecdotes about the life of Changzu, or illustrations from nature, or, you know, stories about famous rulers that illustrate the sort of underlying philosophy of Taoism. And it doesn't state them in a sort of formulaic way. It kind of lets the message come through, kind of like a parable, I guess. On my YouTube channel, I've got a video called Extract from The Way of Changzu, where I read my top 3. So if you could start with that, and then I include a link to that in the description. So Thomas Merton in The Way of Changzu. In terms of Taoism, you can find the Tao Te Ching, or the Lao Tzu, as it's sometimes called, which is their foundational text. You can find that very easily online, and lots of translations. So just pick a modernish translation that will be relatively readable. You know, you're not reading it primarily for absolute scholarly accuracy. You're reading it to get the gist of it. But yeah, I'd say the way of Changzu, the Tao Te Ching, or the Tao Te Ching. Who else would I recommend? Brian Davies is a good Christian philosopher. I don't know what denomination he's in, but he's a good Christian philosopher. I've referenced C.S. Lewis before now, but I feel like I've now got what I'm going to get from him. But he was a really big part of my early Christian journey. I found he's very good at taking an issue, and when I was early on in my Christian journey, I would sort of flip from idea to idea, and I'd think of an issue, and I'd get really sort of worked up about it and go, oh, maybe this is a big problem that no Christian in 2,000 years has thought of. And then I just sitting on my sofa thought of it, which is absurd when I think about it like that. But C.S. Lewis is a very good way of kind of breaking it down and saying, well, here are some of the different options. Here's the different way of seeing it. And just sort of very gently walking you through those ideas. And again, he's got his sort of philosophical apologetic books, but he's also got his fiction. And again, if you read them side by side, eventually you start to see lots of interesting patterns and observations. And again, yeah, if you're philosophically at a reasonably high level, then David Oderberg is a good step. If you like Ed Fesser and co, David Oderberg's another good route to go down, but he very much writes for an academic audience. So I wouldn't encourage that for beginners.
I'll probably give that one a pass. Yeah. That's well above my head.
Yeah, real essentialism would be an expensive mistake to make.
Oh, it's a very good book, but yeah, it's tough.
Have you done that, Dan?
No, I've had the greatest respect for Thomists, and I want to be one. I can't get my head around it. But I think that's a reasonable. There's Eleanor Stump. She's quite good. I think she might be Catholic, but I'm not sure. If you're interested in what I've been reading recently, I've been reading some von Balthasar, which is interesting.
I've heard good things.
So yeah, I don't know.
You're just naming Catholics.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they're Catholic.
I already mentioned N.T. Wright, and I mentioned Craig on many occasions.
That's true.
I'm joking. Too funny.
Well, we've gone past the time allotted, so we'll let you go, and just want to say thank you very much for being on the show, and hope London Theist and the programmer who've been on the chat, and potentially one or two others have been watching. Thank you for your questions, Dan, final comments?
Thank you for chatting to us, and we'll get you back.
Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you.
Well,
yeah. I guess anything, guys, are you happy to put a link to my YouTube channel in the description at some stage?
I think it's already in there, but yeah, if people look up the Philosopher's Cave, is that right? Or Philosophy Cave?
The Philosopher's Cave.
And you're about 20 subscribers away from 100. So yeah, please do subscribe, follow him, and listen into the 4 Ways of Quietness. I've already started that one and recommend it.
Good content.
So yeah, great to have you, Richard, and we'll sign off. For those of you who are watching this on catch up or listening on the podcast, thank you so much for following us. Please do share, review, like, subscribe, all of that stuff. And if you really like what we're doing, we've just tried out StreamYard. Seems to be quite a nice little bit of software that helps us do fancier things and stream in multiple locations at once. If you really want to see this channel grow, well, we are on patreon.com/critical witness, and any support towards us will go towards making this show even better, and would greatly appreciate it. But otherwise, feel free to enjoy the content. It will always be free, and we just enjoy chatting to people and hope you enjoy it as well. So I'm going to end there, and have a good rest of your evening.